welcome, Sean. It's lovely, and I'm so pleased. And I have to tell you that I pulled a few strings to meet and be able to talk with one author that I have quoted for years, and another author who has one of the titles, the best books, Bad-Ass Librarians of Timbuktu. You don't know, when I first went in a bookstore and saw that, I said, oh my God, it's something. So this is just a delight, and we're calling this conversation, and we hope it'll be a conversation and that you'll join in too. Essential libraries for a reason, and that's because libraries have played a special role in many, many cultures for many, many years. And I've had the privilege of working in challenged communities where libraries were actually lifelines for so many people. And with the Library of Congress, we are extending our role in terms of being the world's largest library, but with so many things, and how can we reach out, and the book festival is part of that. Now, the two books, and excuse me if I say this title many times, The Bad-Ass Librarians of Timbuktu and Their Race to Save the World's Most Precious Manuscripts. And I was surprised, though, that the Library of Congress has a connection to the city of Timbuktu in Mali. Back in 2004, the Library of Congress entered into a cooperative agreement with a major library in Timbuktu to digitize and make available online important manuscripts, and many of them were rescued in the subject of your book. And we also put some of the manuscripts on tour, World War Tour.
I think that was pretty much the first exposure of the manuscripts of Timbuktu in the United States. Yeah, the first time that people anywhere here had an opportunity to see what was out there. Before that, it had been kind of just a secret, really. Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that and our other author, Alberto Manguel. Once had a personal library, and I know many of you have personal libraries. I'm just guessing. Of more than 35,000 books. 35,000 books. But
and growing.
And still growing, because once you're a book lover and buyer, I 10 more books today. But when you left your house.
We sold it in France, and we moved to New York. And in New York, we have an apartment the size of this table. So 35,000 books don't fit there. So they're in boxes, awaiting the day of the resurrection.
Where? And then your book is about that.
Yeah.
Packing my library.
That's right. And it's called an Elegy and 10 Digressions.
Yes. So I want to share with people why I have quoted you for years.
Yeah. Well, I always grew up among books. I always consider myself a reader rather than a writer. But before I get into that, I have something to say, if you will excuse me. We're all here talking about books, enjoying the magnificent gestures of the Library of Congress. But some few hundred kilometers from here, there isn't a concentration camp for children that was set up in Texas, where the children not only don't have access to books, but they are, many of them, sexually abused. They sleep on cement floors, and 6 of them have already died. So that is happening within the confines of this country. So we can talk about books and the importance of books, and the Library of Congress is a lighthouse of what we hope this country will one day become. But right now, this is happening, and we won't be able to say, like the Germans said of the concentration camps during the Nazi times, we didn't know. So we know and we're not doing anything about it.
The part The section of your book, History of Reading, which is now in paperback, and when it came out, it was really something because it has different chapters about optics, different things that are very interesting. But the chapter that really struck me, especially in the public library realm, was called Forbidden Reading. And the photograph that introduces that chapter has an image of a woman who looks like she was probably a slave, and she's standing in front of a structure, a very crude structure, and she's holding a book. And this section that I quote, and I'll paraphrase it now, says that as centuries of dictators, slave owners, and other illicit holders of power have always known, an illiterate crowd is the easiest to rule. And if you cannot prevent people from learning to read, the next best recourse is to limit its scope.
Quite.
And then it goes on to talk about instances of that. And so, Joshua, your book kind of touches on that theme.
Yeah, I think the jihadists who took over Timbuktu knew that they were taking over a city that was synonymous with culture on the continent, that had a vibrant secular and religious culture going back to the 14th century. They knew that thanks to the efforts of a handful of these librarians in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, that it had really kind of recaptured its identity as a center of culture. These books had been gathered up from around the desert and placed in libraries across the city, and Westerners were coming to visit, scholars were coming to visit, Malians were coming to visit, so it had reclaimed its identity as an intellectual capital, really. So
many of these books were Quranic books.
It was a combination. I mean, I think perhaps had it been, in fact, I think that originally these books were produced by Quranic schools. So, and the first books that were copied and distributed in Timbuktu in 11th, 12th centuries were Qurans and the Hadith and religious texts. But gradually over the next 100, 200, 300 years, it developed this. So you sort of had a religious culture and a secular culture. You had books, as I write in my book, about manuscripts about music, about science, about medicine, about history, books that did not directly address God, that essentially celebrated human achievements outside of the realm of religion. And this was the culture that the jihadis entered into when they captured the city in 2012. And although they didn't immediately declare war on the manuscripts, it was pretty clear to the librarians and everybody in the city that they would at some point get around to destroying them because they saw it as a threat to their rule. Yes.
You describe it so movingly. I really was touched by what you can read like a thriller. You want to know whether they will destroy these books or not.
Well, of course.
Could you just go over the basic outlines for people?
Of the tale,
yeah,
essentially?
The tale.
The story itself, yes. Well, in fact, although immediately it wasn't clear that they were after the manuscripts, they did pretty quickly begin to destroy aspects of Timbuktu culture. They destroyed shrines, they destroyed, mostly they were attacking the shrines and mosques of the Sufi culture of Timbuktu, which was anathema to the jihadist interpretation of Islam. So it was pretty clear that at some point they were going to go after the manuscripts as well. The character in my book, the protagonist, Abdul Qadir Haidara, who came from a long line of librarians going back hundreds of years, who had many books, many manuscripts in his family's collection, and was totally devoted to the written word, sort of took on the role, the role of protector. He concocted a scheme with fellow librarians, first to take these books out of the libraries, libraries that had been created over the last decade with money from the Ford Foundation, with money from Western Europe, with European, American, and Middle Eastern foundations and governments. So the first idea was to take these manuscripts and move them out of the libraries where they were obvious targets. So this was a couple of month process that involved stealthily taking them in the middle of the night, finding friends who would be willing to secrete the books inside their cellars, basements, warehouses, whatever, out of reach of the jihadis. And this is where the manuscripts remained for the first couple of months. The jihadist war against culture, war against the occupation, the war against the occupied continue. They started carrying out acts of violence, Sharia justice, chopping off hands, chopping off legs, executing people. Things were heating up there. The librarians, including Abdul Qadir, quickly, well, by that point realized that perhaps it's not safe enough just to leave them in the city. So the next step became to somehow get them out of Timbuktu and move them south across the desert, semi-desert, to government territory. So sort of brazenly going past the checkpoints, innocently, hiding books inside trucks and jeeps and eventually boats, and making this massive smuggling operation over the course of several months involving 250,000, 300,000 manuscripts to get them to the safety of Bamako, which was in government hands and where they would presumably be safe. So that's the story. The book essentially relates how these ordinary fellows, teenagers, librarians, or the ordinary people of Timbuktu got together to outwit the jihadist occupiers and preserve their culture, preserve their identity.
And I must tell you, as a librarian, to hear librarians concocted something and they were being stealth and they were doing all of this. You all don't know. Librarians, we have t-shirts that say librarians, feisty fighters for freedom.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah.
They are.
So we
was-
kind of, if the going gets tough, we get.
I knew I hit a nerve when I got to Dallas back in 2016 when the book came out, and I got to Dallas for the book festival, and I was greeted by about 30 librarians, all wearing Bad-Ass Librarians buttons on their shirts.
Yes, you did a lot for our image. You really did. And I got a chance to meet the hero.
I know you did.
Was at
I know you
NYU. He
Amazing.
received an honorary degree this year.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And was just
Yeah.
really. And
He's also quite an operator, by the way.
Oh, is he?
Oh yeah, he's an operator. In addition to being just a heroic figure, he sort of has played that up quite a bit, and managed. I think not for personal gain, but for the for the benefit of his libraries.
The meek, silent librarian is a fictional character.
Yeah, there's nothing meek about these guys.
I don't think I've ever met a meek librarian.
We hide it well.
There is a wonderful story because your character is heroic in so many ways. But for instance, during the Nazi occupation of Paris, when the Allies entered, Nabokov's sister was a librarian. And with the Germans trying to flee and the Allies coming in, she ran around to the houses of Germans who had borrowed books from her library to get them back. Now, that's a bad-ass librarian.
And I'm sure you've had experiences working with librarians in your careers and lives. Have you remember any of them?
I remember the guy I feared most in my high school was the high school librarian. He was a tough guy, huge disciplinarian, big guy, and probably the most aggressive of the teachers at the school. So I don't have any illusions of meek and librarian don't go together in my mind. No.
Oxymoron.
Primo Levi tells about the librarian at the University of Turin who had ordered the book so carefully he didn't want anyone to take them out because he didn't want the order destroyed. But it is so moving to see how librarians are essential to someone's life. There are so many stories, not only from writers, but from ordinary people whose life has changed because of a librarian. because of the librarian understanding this need we have to relate to the past, to find our identity in literature, to learn empathy, to learn decency and civic responsibilities through stories that we love. My favorite character, one of my favorite characters, is Little Red Riding Hood, because she's the example of civil disobedience. Her mother tells her to go to her grandmother's house, and no, she goes to the forest, picks flowers. But without that civil disobedience, there wouldn't be any story, there wouldn't be any wolf, it would be terribly boring.
I never thought of Little Red Riding Hood like that. I started as a children's librarian, I must say. That's
Bad-Ass Little Red Riding Hood.
all right. We all love to say that. And so with the great libraries and the library in Timbuktu, are you still in touch with any of the people?
I haven't been back there since 2014, but I have the book is about to come out as a documentary film in the winter with the same title, of course.
Oh, nice.
And so through the director who actually made the film stealthily in Timbuktu, shot it on location, which is an incredible achievement itself. I've gotten a feeling for what the atmosphere is like there, which is still not good. I know that Abdulkader Hyder has still not begun to return the books, that the libraries are still all shut down. There are no tourists, there are no scholars, there are no people going up there. It's been that way really, it's now six years since the jihadis were thrown out, and it's still, I mean, when the director and his tiny camera crew went up there, they had to arrange through they got United Nations transport because there are no flights going in there. They got the help of the UN in providing them with security. They had to keep the entire mission clandestine, and they wanted to actually film, to recreate in the documentary the jihadist takeover of the city. And we're going to do it on location. And when they were warned that perhaps the idea of a convoy of 100 vehicles flying black jihadi flags across the desert of Mali as a documentary reenactment might not go down well with trigger-happy Malian troops and UN peacekeepers. So they restaged that part in Morocco. So yeah, the whole situation, the whole situation remains in limbo. And as far as I know, not a single library has since opened. The books are still sitting in Bamako in storage, waiting to be transported up the river by boat whenever that day will come. Yeah, but it's really amazing because I remember in 2000 and when I visited the country in 2008, when there were something like 45 libraries. This desolate city. I had visited it in '95. And it was a truly desolate place. It was coming off a Tuareg war, completely cut off from the world. In 2008, largely on thanks to these libraries, and thanks as well to the opening up of the Malian Music Festival, the festival in the desert, the place had been completely transformed into this cultural hub. As I said, when I got there, you had scholars from Germany, from Norway, coming to see the manuscripts. Tourists were coming, I mean, everybody from, backpacking, French to, middle-aged tourists, Americans, unpackaged tourists coming up to Timbuktu just to see the libraries. It was such a spectacular achievement, and it's all of course, gone. But it was a window of about 4 or 5 years when you had that going on. Yeah.
And that's a national loss, and you write about a personal loss. You mentioned your books are waiting to be resurrected?
Well, no. The situation was simply a bureaucratic mess, and we had to leave France and pack the books. But they're there. I hope that I will be able to set them up again. But life balances things out because at the same time that we were leaving the library, I was appointed director of the National Library of Argentina. So I packed 40,000 books and inherited about 10 million. Now, I must say, and I suppose you share this, that as director of a library, you read far less and you write far less than ever in your life because you're too busy administrating and dealing with bureaucracy and trying to raise funds and all these boring things. And there the books tempting.
They're right there.
But you realize how important, I go back to your Bad-Ass Librarians. We have so many examples of libraries being the center that holds society together and also heals society. In Mexico, there is an extraordinary phenomenon called salas de lectura, and maybe you know about this. It's grassroots libraries that spring up especially in locations of great violence and drug dealings and so on. And it is mainly women who constitute, I think, 80% of the readers of this world. And they, in their homes, they set up reading groups and a sort of communal library, not 40,000 books, but a much more important library of maybe 20, 30 books. And people come there, especially young people, and this is extraordinary. The level of violence diminishes by something between 70 and 80%. This is what a library can do. And yes, that's why I think librarians, real librarians, are the heartthrob of any civilized society.
So I was just listening to this and thinking about the universality of libraries and the meaning that they seem to have across all societies, and that really hit home to me early on in 2006 when I first met Abdulkader Hyder'a, and he had been talking about that what was going on in Timbuktu was actually echoed in really far more remote I mean, you think Timbuktu was remote. That was actually the hub of the north, you know. But he said, go out, I'll arrange a trip for you out into the distant corners of the desert. And he arranged a trip for me, and we drove for about 150 miles to the middle of nowhere, godforsaken desert, patch of desert, Tuareg encampment, and this old guy, I met this old man, and he just sort of beckoned, come this way, and he took me into a darkened shed and opened the door, and there was a trunk, and he opened the trunk, and you know, there was a pile of manuscripts dating back 500-600 years. There had been Tuareg wars, instability. They had buried these in the desert, but it was a period of calm. They'd returned them to the village. This was the library. It was a shed with a box, but it had 50 or 60 of these ancient books in it, and I opened it, and pages were kind of fluttering away as I opened them, but you know, magnificent. One was a Quran, and it had these magnificent drawings. You know, I was looking at things that no other Westerner had ever seen from 500, 600 years ago of the great mosque of Mecca. And others were secular volumes, but you could just see that this was, of all the things in this village, this collection in this trunk was what gave them, you know, meaning and hope, and it was the history of the village, the history of the people in it, the shared knowledge, all contained in this place. And it hit me then about, you know, in whatever form, libraries in every culture are just fundamental to that culture.
We have to remember also that there are societies that have an oral culture.
Yes.
And for those societies, the library is the memory of the elders and the people responsible in the community. But it is true that for the societies of the book, the library holds not only the memory of that society, but also the identity of its readers. And if you want to know who you are, the library is there to tell you. Richard Ovenden, whom you know, the director of the Bodleian Library, gave me once, I think, the best definition of a library. He said, the library is the place of evidence. So if you want to know the fact, if you want to understand false truth and lies that are out there in society, and in our time, where a fact seems to have exactly the same weight as an invented story, the library has the documents, will tell you, we won't make up your mind for you, but it's there. You can come and see it.
And librarians have been proponents of making sure that voices from all different cultures
Yes.
are encouraged to be there. Because I remember my first, and I talk about this when I say, what's your favorite book? I say, well, it's the book that really, there was a library in a storefront in Jamaica, Queens. I was about 7 or 8, and PS 96 in a storefront library, and I don't know what librarian put this book in my hand, but it was Bright April. And it was the first time I saw myself in a book, because it was a little African-American girl with 2 pigtails, and she was a brownie, I was a brownie, and I loved to read, but I had never seen myself. And if we say that books are so important, and we tell young people this, and they don't see themselves reflected in it, what is that saying? So books should be windows on the world, but they should also be mirrors. And it's important to make sure that when we develop the libraries and things, that we have those voices, and we make sure that
there
people
has
are
to be that
represented.
diversity, because otherwise you rely on what is there with readers, which is the capacity of translating a story that doesn't represent you into your own. So a gay child will read Romeo and Juliet as Romeo and Romeo, or Juliet and Juliet, or a black child will identify Anne of Green Gables and turn her red hair into the hair of her color. We have all done that.
We've had to, of a certain age, but now, and that's what's so wonderful at the book festival, when I see the variety of authors and illustrators and people, and the young people that reflected, and the different experiences, what we've been able to do, and we think we need to do it. Now, I know that we have an opportunity for people to ask some questions or make some comments, and so we have a couple of microphones here. And if people would like to come up, and while you're doing that, and I hope you do, that chapter, Forbidden Reading, I want to get back to that, and your book about the experience in Timbuktu, how did those dictators and other illicit holders of power, they knew that reading was power?
Well, in just a brief historical note, in 1660, the King of England decided, following Protestant ethics, that everybody should read, because there you can read your Bible, and so there was an instruction to slave owners to teach their slaves to read. And the slave owners, especially in South Carolina, they were the most virulently opposed to that. And they decided that anyone who taught a slave to read would be punished, and the slave who tried to read would be flogged or have his or her fingers cut off, and then on the third try put to death. And what is so moving is the strategies that the slaves found to read. That they would tell a white kid, oh, how beautiful what they are doing. Show me what you're doing. I'm so proud of you, and so on. So the kid would show them how they formed letters, and that's how they learned to read. I find it, sorry, I banged the microphone, so moving.
Frederick Douglass talks about that in his autobiography.
Yeah.
He knew that, and his famous saying, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. And in fact, when people say, oh, you're the 14th Librarian of Congress since 1802, you're the first female and then feminized profession, librarianship, that's very important, but also, though, the first person of color. And I prepared some speech parts about these laws for my swearing in, and I was going to list them all, amputation and all like that, and then I was reminded gently by my mom that that could be a downer. you're swearing in. Just say how significant it is, but the list was long.
Yeah.
The list was so long.
So long.
Of that.
Yeah.
That was something. So we
Anyway,
have-
congratulations on the intention.
Oh, yes, yes. She knows how to edit me even today.
I'd like to hear the reflections of the authority figures here on the ultimate impacts of the trend toward digitization and the way in which, on the one hand, it may make more things accessible to more people, but on the other hand, the book as such may be in jeopardy. So could we hear
Myrna,
thoughts
yes,
about
you've
that?
got some real thought on that.
I don't read digital books. I don't have a portable phone, and I use my computer as a typewriter. But when I became director of the National Library of Argentina, my first mission was, first of all, to digitize the catalog that wasn't fully digitized, but second, to digitize as many texts as we could, to have an equivalent virtual library of the holdings that we had, because we were located in Buenos Aires. Argentina is a very vast country, and we were the national library of every Argentinian, and they should have access to everything. And it was very important also for aleatory reasons. For instance, the holdings we have, for instance, of the native communities in Argentina were cataloged in the 19th century. So some are under Indians and some are under savages. So obviously this needed to be rehauled, and I wanted to do this working with the leaders of the different native communities. It was incredibly complicated because they have no political power in Argentina. But one of the ways of doing it is digitizing those holdings, as they do in Canada, they do in Australia. And so they digitize the holdings, they send them back to the community, and the community decides what can be shown, what can be read by whom, and what these things are. Because in the 19th century, they said this is a cup, and maybe it was a ritual vase or something else. So digitization for the society is absolutely essential, equivalent to what printing meant at the time of Gutenberg. But I am a private citizen who is over 70 years old, and I like my little routine, and so yes, I still don't read digitized books.
And you'd be heartened to see in the children's stage and the teenage stage, all the young people that are there waiting to get their books signed and their graphic novels, and just waiting and waiting. So there is still a book culture and a physical aspect as well.
I would say in the case of the great libraries of Timbuktu, there's a recognition, just because of the age and the condition of these books, that there had to, early on, Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates was up there in the late 90s, and one of the first things he said when he met Abdulkader Hayden was, we've got to start a digitization program. You know, we're going to give you $1 million to do that. So Abdulkader Hayden took the $1 million and built a physical library instead, because that's what he really wanted. He wanted the building. He wanted the books on display. He wanted a bit of an egomaniac, and he liked the idea of people coming to physically see his books. But right now things have changed. Things have changed, and it is combination. I mean, I think there's a recognition that you have to digitize, and there's a massive digitization program going on for these hundreds of thousands of books. But the books themselves are treasures, you know. They're just spectacular, beautiful books. I mean, the gold leaf and the designs and the calligraphy are so fantastic that in itself, the hard, you know, the actual physical books, there's a recognition. Put a few of them on display. Digitize everything. Make some of them available just to simply look at and appreciate in these physical libraries, and have a balance. So that's what's going on, except that there is no physical library right now, but that's the hope, you know.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm curious about how you came about this story in the first place, how you found out that the librarians were doing this effort, and when you were there in 2014, what your experience was like.
So I was a bureau chief in Africa for Newsweek in the 90s, early 90s, and I traveled all over the continent. And that's when I discovered Mali for the first time. Really an interesting place in a lot of ways. And then when I became a freelance writer a decade later, I just happened to see a small article in 2006 about the manuscripts of Mali, a new effort being made to recover them from the desert, to preserve them. A lot of them were in a state of disrepair. I was intrigued by Mali to begin with. I went up there in 2006. I met Abdelkader Hyder for the first time. Spent about a week up there and wrote a long piece for Smithsonian. Kept going back to Mali and Timbuktu. And then in 2012, when the jihadists invaded the country, my first thought actually was, I wonder what is going to happen to these manuscripts. I had a hunch that they were endangered. I couldn't reach Abdelkader. I had envisioned that he would probably have planned something like taking them out to the desert and burying them, but I had no way of reaching him. It wasn't until a year later, 2013, that I got back in touch and discovered what had been going on, and that led to a magazine piece, another Smithsonian magazine piece, and then when Abdelkader said he would be happy to tell me his whole life story, which I really didn't even know at that point, but we went ahead and did a book. And it was in 2014, this was a year after I went and I visited in August 2013, 5 months after the French had chased the jihadis out of the north of Mali, and then came back again to do more book research in the winter of 2014. It was very raw. The place was, the jihadis had been there for a year. They created incredible physical and emotional psychic damage. Plus, they were still scattered around in the bush. But I had to get up to Timbuktu to talk to people and find out what was going on. So that involved some pretty hair-raising trips through the desert, hoping that I wouldn't be waylaid and kidnapped, as about 10 Westerners over the previous few years had been. And in fact, even now, there are a couple of them. Almost all of them have been released on ransom, but there are 2 or 3 who've been in these jihadi camps for more than a decade, which is hard to imagine. So it definitely crossed my mind that I ran a risk of ending up one of them.
The book's like a thriller. It is a thriller. We have time for one more round. We have to go on this side.
All right.
Will be
Speaking
available.
of the desert and burying books there, I was a volunteer in the Gobi Desert where they're still digging up dinosaur bones and texts that were buried there. And they were lost and forgotten by a generation that passed on. I'm wondering if either of you can speak to the effect on either a community or an individual that's had to make that hard decision to dismantle their library and hide it and maybe never see it again.
Wow, and you're,
You want to take that one?
yeah, you're,
I hope I will see it again, but it's heartbreaking. Your library is what you are, at least in my case. It holds memories of every moment of my life, of my friends, of the most important discoveries I've made that gave me words to name my experience of every day. So to put them away was really heartbreaking, which is why I called the book an elegy. But at the same time, I added 10 digressions, first of all, because I can't think in a straight line, but because I wanted to speak of the different aspects, what loss signifies for a reader, what memory signifies, because you have to begin to rely on the text that you remember, and a little bit like Bradbury's Men in Fahrenheit 451, you become the books you have read. And so all those aspects are there in my book, with the hope, and I insist on this, that the library will be set up somewhere. I want at this point to donate the library to an institution that might hold it as a whole, because it's a library of the history of reading, really. But I think that will happen. Whether it will happen in my lifetime or not, I can't tell.
Libraries that are lost in communities have an impact. It's very hard to close a library in a community because of the same thing. It's the individual library loss as well as the community.
Abdulkader Haider, when he was starting out in the 80s as a government librarian in charge of trying to recover these manuscripts which had been scattered across the desert, and he would go out in his, walking through the desert essentially, or taking boats, trying to persuade these manuscript owners that had the manuscripts in their families for generations to give them to the government library in Timbuktu. That you can see them, you'll be free to visit them, they'll be kept here in great condition and preserved. They're sitting in the trunk in your hut, and they're disintegrating. And it was a hell of an effort to get them to part with these things. This was part of their family identity. It took incredible persistence, bribery, all sorts of tricks and persuasion to get them to give them up. And even when the jihadis had invaded the country, Timbuktu, it was again an effort of persuasion to try to get people were in denial that there was anything wrong. They didn't want to give up the books. Even, you'll send them off to Bamako, they'll be thrown in with a bunch of others, we'll lose track of them, I don't even know what manuscripts I have. None of them had ever done indexing, or they had no idea what was in their collections, and suddenly they were asked to give them up to a relative stranger and send them through the desert 1,000 miles. So it was a constant struggle to get people to part from what they considered to be the most valuable possessions in their lives and the whole essence of their identity.
I know I'll wrap it up, it says here, because as you could tell, we could go on and on.
There's a badass librarian.
There's a badass librarian, but I want to thank both of you, the national loss, personal loss.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I loved it.
And they're both Packing My Library and the Bad-Ass Librarians.